Record on. Yay. Okay, so let's get started here. I'd like to talk about dialogue trees, and I'm going to begin by asking you guys, what is the game design function of a dialogue tree? Why do you put dialogue trees into games? So why do people, game designers, put dialogue trees into games? Any ideas?
It depends on the game.
Okay.
Sometimes, and it may even depend on what part of the game you're playing. So in some cases, they put in dialogue trees to change what happens if you have a role-playing game or maybe a strategy game like Alpha Centauri. Then you have conversations with the characters, and that actually has a meaningful impact on the gameplay and on how events progress. And sometimes they just put in a dialogue tree to offer information to the player. A lot of times that's how they do things, and they don't necessarily change what happens, but you just go through the dialogue tree to kind of get information from that character, get that character's perspective on the world you're exploring.
Other thoughts?
I think the best usage I've seen for dialogue trees is to let the player decide how they want to play their character, to let them show their character's personality through different choices.
How does that affect the game?
It can, if the game responds to how the character acts and how the character's personality.
Okay, so what you're saying is that dialogue trees are end up specifying the values of certain variables, which will then affect the behavior of the game.
If they program it that way, yes.
Okay. And then we also have the thing that they provide information. On the provision of information, is there a failure mode? That is, can you enter a dialogue tree and not get the information you seek?
So if you're providing information, I would say there's not a failure state. Basically, when they set dialogue trees up that way, they make it so that either you pause your conversation with that character and you go off into something else, and you can come back and get the rest of the information usually. Like the choice is not get the information or not, the choice is how much information you get at that particular point in time, usually. So it's like different degrees of success, but you're always going to get some information.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, other thoughts on the function of dialogue trees in game design?
No, I think Chris stated it pretty well.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'd like to offer a very simplified view, which does not recognize some of the finer points you guys have raised, but at the same time makes it possible to think in very different terms about what a dialogue tree can do. And so what I'm going to do here is shift over to, come on, I wanna, boy, Zoom has such a lousy speaker view. Start share. Why do they say that? Why do they? Okay, I'm there we go. I am showing the I'm doing the screen share here, and I'd like to show, oh boy, stupid thing. Here, let's, there. Here is a simplified diagram of the simplest possible dialogue tree. Binary choices on a bare tree. That is, there are no cross connections. And so this is the simplest possible dialogue tree. And this, we can go a step further with this guy here, who is a dialogue tree with some crossed connections. And the way I present this, or the way I suggest we think about it, is as follows. That is, a dialogue tree, when viewed this way, can be seen as a boolean gate. That is, if you were to choose the path marked by the colored circles, then it is a boolean gate which requires you to provide, which is evaluated by the values of B and B1 and B1B. That is, if you follow, if that is the correct path, then if you follow that path, then the value of that expression is true, which means, yes, you do get the Vorpal blade or the secret password or whatever. Whereas if you follow any other path through the dialogue tree, then you don't get, you get a false result for this expression. So when viewed in this very simplistic fashion, we say that the that this is a simple Boolean gate. When we bring in a the crossed connections, we add in OR values to the gates, so we get a more complex Boolean expression, but it's still a Boolean gate. And that's, I would say that this is a reasonably good simplification of what dialogue trees do. They basically are gate systems that provide something of value to the player if the player does the right things. This doesn't apply to the point Chris Conley made regarding specification of personality attributes. However, I'll point out that, well, the main point I'd like to make about all of these is that these are fundamentally Boolean systems. That is, when you traverse one of these trees, you're setting up a lot of Boolean values. Now, what I'd like to discuss, or what I have discovered with Le Morte d'Arthur and well, the dialogues in dialogue trees in Le Morte d'Arthur are numeric in style. That is, by entering one of these circles, you in effect gain points. Damn it, I screwed this up. I should have had some negative values in here. So the idea is each pass can give a different final result. Final results listed along the bottom. But yes, some of these circles should have had negative numbers in them. Anyway, the point of all of this is that this approach means that there are no really wrong answers. That is, every decision made by the player is functionally significant. Whereas in the Boolean trees, you can take a course of action, you can make decisions that basically add up to nothing. And I find that, I believe that's poor design. If the player should, to use Sid Meier's famous definition, the player should always have a set of interesting options. If an option is a dead end, accomplishes absolutely nothing, then it's not as interesting as a situation where your options, you're choosing between slightly better, slightly worse options, but there are no dead end options that just lead you nowhere. So this is the approach I have been using, and I'd like to observe that this is far more difficult to design than the boolean trees, because it's very easy to simply say, well, this boolean tree is this section is a dead end. Doesn't get you anywhere. Whereas in this numeric system, you really have to think carefully about the value of each decision, both in absolute terms and in relative terms. And I've had to spend a lot of time working these things out. It's been quite a task. I wonder if I can bring up.
What does the value get you?
The values affect global variables that that determine the outcome. But see, every tree adds something to these values. So all of the trees combine, even though they're presented at different times. Moreover, this can apply to different global variables. In my system, I have 4 global variables, and some of the trees will influence several variables. For example, two of the important variables concern how Arthur is perceived as being a virtuous person, and how Arthur is perceived as being a dominating person. How much do you fear him and how much do you like him? Sasha, you have a question?
Yeah, when you say you have 4 global variables, you mean 4 global variables per character, right?
These variables apply only to the player, because the player is the one making the decisions.
Okay.
So I'm being a little coy about what's going on in here.
Basically, you're managing state and p-values.
Yep. Actually, just p-values. But let me see if I can bring up. Do I have? No, it's not in there. I'm going to come over here and and encounter trees, and here we go. Here's a cute one. You don't want to start. Oh, maybe you're too big. Let's see. Here we go. Let me force this one. See if it will work here. You're too big, aren't you? Well, we'll try to squeeze it in somehow. Here we go. Let's drop it down in size so it'll fit. Maybe I can get that. There we go. So here's one of the trees. Unfortunately, I don't show the values in this diagram, but basically this is a dialogue tree between Arthur and Merlin. Little girl dies, and Arthur and Merlin asks Arthur what it is exactly that upsets him. in other words, the real value of this is that it permits something. I first recommended this, God, about 30 some odd years ago. I'm going to go ahead and shut this down and return. Well, we might as well return to this. I first recommended this about 30 years ago, in which I pointed out that the real value of dialogue trees, if they're done properly, is as Socratic dialogues. Have any of you ever, I better explain what a Socratic dialogue is. I'll ask though, have any of you ever read the Socratic dialogues in Plato? Tisk, tisk, tisk. They're an important part of everybody's education, at least read one of them. Basically, the Socratic dialogues show a very powerful teaching method that's very difficult to do. But the concept actually was used heavily in, I think I can leave screen sharing now. Yeah, come on. Yeah, there we go. The concept of the Socratic dialogue was used as an expository thing for many years. The dialogues showed up as ways of expressing ideas, geez, as late as about 1700, and then they fell out of favor. Basic idea of the Socratic dialogue is you've got your teacher, Socrates, and your student. And the trick is these are one-on-one experiences. The idea is that we're not just teaching in the sense of big shot lecturing at a bunch of students. Rather, it's a one-on-one experience. And what Socrates would do, he'd start off saying, so tell me, Crito, what is love? And Crito gives an answer. I think it's blah, blah, blah. And then Socrates would say, you know, that's what I used to think too. But, you know, there's a problem here. If love is this, then, well, imagine this situation here and that coming in, and that wouldn't be love, would it? And Crito says, well, yeah, but, blah, blah, blah. And Socrates goes back and forth with Crito. Basically, all he ever does is ask questions. He never says, this is the answer. Instead, he elicits the answer from basically his straight man. Just by pointing out every step of the way, the straight man gives an answer and Socrates blocks it and says, no. And so straight man goes over here, and then Socrates says, yeah, but if you do that, it's wrong. And straight man goes over here, and blah, 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 blah. And basically they are traversing a kind of tree. And that the end result is always some surprising thing where Crito or whomever it is ends up saying, golly gee, Socrates, that sure is surprising. I would never have thought of that, but golly gee, I suppose that's the way it's got to be. And I mean, it really is always a straight man whom Socrates is working. And he managed to come up with all sorts of surprising results. The thing is, the intention, pardon?
Sounds great for Socrates.
Yeah. I mean, these were meant to be educational. Really what happened was Plato wrote it all down, and then you come along and read it, and supposedly you learn. However, actually doing it is really hard. I've tried doing it, and it's hard to keep up. It is, however, far and away the best way to teach somebody, because they end up, instead of just shoving knowledge down somebody's throat, you are interacting with their mind, with their own thinking, and allowing them to, to show you how they think about it, and then reacting to what they are actually thinking. So it is far and away the ideal way to teach. But it's really hard, and it can only be done in a one-on-one situation. Well, golly gee, when a user is with a computer, it's one user and one computer. That's a one-on-one, right? And in fact, I built several Socratic dialogues. The best one I built, now these were boolean, and in fact, the standard form of the boolean of the Socratic dialogue is fundamentally boolean in nature. I built one where Isaac Newton is talking to a straight man about the apple falling off the tree. And he starts off by asking, gee, what do you think? The apple left the tree and moved towards the earth. Now, do you think it's because the earth is pulling on the apple? Or maybe the apple is pulling on the earth? Or maybe they're both pulling on each other. And then the straight man gives an answer, and I have the tree for each of the answers. And in each case, if he gives a bad answer, Newton just says, well, if that's true, blah, blah, blah. But if that's true, blah, blah, blah. And eventually the straight man, or the player in this case, ends up reaching, one way or the other, the correct conclusion. So I've been advising the world to, do some Socratic dialogues on a computer. They'd be excellent. They are hard to do, which may be why nobody else has ever tried it. But in effect, what I'm doing here is a numeric Socratic dialogue, where instead of forcing the player to the correct conclusion, I'm giving the player the opportunity to reach a correct conclusion, or a more correct conclusion, or a less correct conclusion. And that in turn affects the outcome. So
What makes
anyway,
them so difficult to create?
Well, you have to anticipate every possible reaction of the player. Now, that's something you get good at if you were trained in debate in school. Were any of you were you on debate team or anything like that? That's
nope.
The value of debate team is that you're required to debate both sides. And so you get very good at thinking about a problem from multiple angles. Ooh, I could say this, but what if he said that? It's kind of like chess, except with ideas instead of pieces. And it also makes you much more open-minded. But teachers, good teachers, do this very well. If you get a lot of experience teaching, you realize students don't think the same way you think, and so you get very good at anticipating what's going on in their heads. And that apparently is a rare skill, because you, well, I'll give you the example. How many times have you had a FaceTime meeting or a video meeting with somebody who's holding their thing and, there are a lot of people who do this crap, and you have to wonder, what do they think other people are seeing? Are they even thinking about that? Um, all sorts of things where people just say and do things that reflect a complete failure to put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I will point out that when I was young, I was very much this way. I'll never forget a case where I was in a car with a group of a bunch of students had gone to university to evaluate whether they wanted to go. And on the way back, I was sewing a sort of a hat thing I was making. And I was sitting in the car and I would take the, and with the needle and the only problem was right here was another person's face. And I was completely unaware, that what she might be experiencing. And at a certain point, she said, "Would you mind not putting that needle in my face?" Oh, gee, never thought of that. So anyway, the ability to put yourself in another person's place is very important. And I will warn you that as male nerds, you are probably very bad at that. The worst people of all the different personality types I've met, it's the male nerds who are absolutely blissfully unaware of what's going on in somebody else's head. In general, women are much better at this than men, largely because throughout human evolution, men were always bigger and stronger than women. And so if you didn't want to be beaten to death, you learned to figure out what they were thinking. Anyway, let's answer this question. Talos principle. Okay, character interactions work similarly. Okay, Talos principle. And what is the general theme or point of the game?
It explores the nature of consciousness and the nature of morality. So this is a small spoiler, but it's a retelling of the Garden of Eden story, but instead of God, you have human beings, and instead of Adam and Eve, you have an AI. And so you're playing the role of the AI, and you have these Socratic dialogue conversations with basically a version of the serpent. And the serpent has these conversations to try to convince you to give in to temptation. And over the course of the game. And so the conversations are super detailed. It goes back and forth between some puzzles and between these conversations with this one major character. And it starts off kind of, it introduces you to the character as though it's not going to be that big of a deal, and it kind of eases you into the idea that this character is more complex than you thought it at the beginning of the game. And it's one of my favorite games. The serpent character, yes, that's the link that analyzed there. Yeah, so the serpent character has a very nihilistic worldview, and it is very good at challenging the conventional understanding of consciousness and how the mind works. And of course, it goes over questions of artificial intelligence and uses that to talk about consciousness and whether human beings have a soul and things like that. And then it delves into the nature of morality and so forth. And there are a couple of other characters in the game that kind of represent other views on the matter, but you can't really interact with them as much.
Hmm.
With Milton, you have several conversations with over the course of the game, and Milton tries to break down your way of thinking about it. And then so it's dialogue trees, but it sets a bunch of variables based on what you say. And then by the time you get close to the end of the game, based on what you've done with Milton, it'll give you different options about how you want to go through your final interactions with Milton, and that affects what ending you get to the game.
Hmm.
So
Very
it's-
interesting.
yeah,
I'm impressed.
it's
What is the typical playtime for a single game?
it takes a while. So what they did is it's a really interesting thing. So it goes back and forth between puzzles, which have very little to do with character interaction, and then the character interaction. And they're almost like separate parts of the game, separate game modes, so to speak.
Hmm.
And so I think they did that to kind of make it feel one of the effects is that it gives you kind of the character interaction as a reward for solving a certain number of puzzles, which makes it, feel like the character interaction is kind of a reward. And it also it makes it feel like there's more character interaction because it's spread over the course of the entire playthrough.
Hmm.
I think probably about 20 to 30 hours would be my guess. I played through the game more than once because I wanted to get the different endings and go through the conversations in different ways. But I can actually look at Steam real quick, and I think it'll tell me how much time I put into the game overall. There's also a DLC, which is kind of a miniature sequel, and that has multiple characters that you can interact with. And I think the DLC kind of focuses a little bit more on the character interaction. But let me look at Steam real quick and see exactly how much time I spent on it. So, as principal, I spent 43.6 hours on the game total. So, that's including one playthrough through the DLC and 2 playthroughs through the main game. So probably about 15 to 20 hours for the main game, I would say, for one playthrough.
Rats. I don't have that much time to invest, but I will at least read all the reviews I can find of it. Normally,
Okay.
I've found that
There's actually a really good series of reviews, and I think the last review has an interview with the people who wrote the game. There's 2 main writers who wrote everything in the game, and of course they wrote dialogue for the Socratic Dialogue, and I think that made a difference in how they wrote the game because there were 2 main writers, and I think they were kind of having, as they were writing, the 2 writers were interacting with each other. And but they talk about the frustrations that the writers had because the game, like the company hired these writers, and the company already had the puzzles kind of designed, and they hired these 2 writers to come in and put together a story that worked decently well with puzzles.
so. They took a puzzle game and added some dialogue trees to it.
Yes, yes, and I think the writers were a bit frustrated with that, but it's still the writers did a fantastic job, especially knowing how they had to put it all together. And in the DLC, I think uh, they changed things a little bit to focus more on the characters in the DLC. I wish I could remember the name of this website. I'll link to the website later on Thaddeus. But yeah, there's these really good things where they interview the people who wrote the story and go into how they put these dialogues together, and it's really interesting.
Do any of the dialogue choices affect the gameplay outside of the trees?
They affect the ending, and I think it's just the ending. Which ending you get changes based on your interactions with a couple of the characters. And other than that, I don't think it changes what happens. I think what the game designers wanted, I think the game designers were expecting that some of the people playing the game wouldn't want to have any of the story stuff. I think they designed it so that you could play it play through the puzzles and kind of ignore the story. Or you could play it with puzzles and delve super deep into the story based on what you wanted to do. And so they kind of separated the dialogue trees from the puzzles for the most part. And of course, I love the story. That's my favorite part of the game, pretty much. The puzzles are pretty fun, but the puzzles are mostly not always very original. Like they're a lot of fun to play through, but it's the sort of puzzles that you see in other games. It's the dialogue and the storytelling that really is the core of the game for me.
Hey
But,
guys, we got this hot dog with lots of great ketchup and mustard and relish. Would you put a wiener in for us?
Yeah. 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 Something along those lines. But they they I can't control how they design the game.
It definitely sounds interesting. I really
Yeah.
want to look into that. So thanks for the reference. So other comments, just, free discussion here.
I don't know. I guess like Chris, in your tree that you showed from Lamar Doctor, you said you just have 4 global variables, which the different choices can alter. But do those variables affect the outcomes of any choices, or which events are presented to the player in the course of play before the end?
Very slightly. The design is surprisingly linear. It's very different, but it's certainly very different from anything I've ever done before. Yet at the same time, I think, I'm not sure if I've said this before, but this is the first design I've ever done that I think might actually be, that I might be able to call art. I think it's got some very powerful stuff in it, but I'm going to be very coy about it because much of its power comes from the surprise value of just how unexpected everything is. So again, I mean, you guys will still get first crack at it or something like that, but I don't want to ruin it for you either.
Okay.
So is most of the event selection just like that directed graph based purely on the binary style decisions in the tree that you showed?
Actually, the primary structure, basically, I would describe the structure of it as lots of linear stuff with occasional dialogue trees.
Okay.
Well, the dialogue trees, let's see, there are right now about 370 encounters in the entire system. And certainly more than 100. Between 100 and 150 of those are part of dialogue trees.
Okay.
So yeah, basically it's just linear dialogue tree, linear dialogue tree, linear dialogue tree, all the way to the end. And at the end, there are just 3 final branches. So there are 3 conclusions and only 3. So it's strange.
Very much look forward to playing it.
Yeah, I'm actually, I've got all of the encounters in place. I'm going through tuning them now. I've got a bit more work there. In fact, just today I did some stuff. One of the dialogue trees was too thin, and so I'm expanding it. But the next step will be I've written a statistical analysis tool that goes through and plays with all sorts of random decisions and does so 100 times, and then spits out statistical analysis of the results. And then I use that to go back and revise, tune it. That's one nice thing about this kind of design. You really can subject it to statistical analysis to get you know, to balance it properly. Once that's done, it will be playable, and that might be sometime in May if things go well. Actually, the main thing though is that with spring coming, we've got the wildfire season coming up, and they're warning us this is gonna be a bad one. And so I am working really hard cleaning up floor fuel in the forest around the house. And I've got a gigantic slash pile. This is the slash pile is where you put all the stuff that you need to get rid of, and then you burn it. And mine is about 12 feet high and 15 or 20 feet in diameter. Several, quite a few tons. And now I'm building a second slash pile. Anyway, so that I'm not going to be able to work full time on Lemort Tour, but I'm still hopeful that I'll have it running by May, in which case I'll invite you guys to mess around with it and give me your thoughts. Actually, the next big step will be coming up with the artwork for it, because we want to have at least some kind of illustrations. Hannah, you have a question?
Yeah, just thumbs up.
Oh, okay. So unfortunately, each encounter needs some kind of image. Now, there's a lot of duplication. For example, when you're talking to Guinevere, it's just an image of Guinevere, and there are a lot of conversations with Guinevere, but there's still going to be a need for a lot of artwork, and I'm not quite sure how I'll handle that. So, but you guys don't need artwork. You're designers. You don't care about that crap. So,
Can you tell us a little bit more about the statistical tool that you're developing?
it's pretty straightforward. It basically it runs through the whole game. Wherever there's an option, wherever there's a choice that can be made, it uses a random number to decide what choice is made. And as it does so, it accumulates the net scores in each of the 4 variables and accumulates those, and then does this 100 times and comes up with means and standard deviations for each of the variables. And then all many times in a design, you're going to end up doing a face slap and saying, why didn't I think of that earlier? When I first started doing this, and I'd get a result and I'd say, geez, this variable here is just too high. I need to bring it down. And so I'd go back adjusting values in every encounter. And then it occurred to me, the face slap came when I realized, why not initialize it to something other than 0? Duh. So there are a lot of, I'm sure you guys have experienced the same thing many, many times. So that was one of my face slap moments. So it's much easier to tune it now, although I still go through looking at individuals, pushing different values up or down just for, my design sense tells me this is wrong. So let's see, other questions?
You said the statistical tool goes through about 100 tests. Do you think computers nowadays would be fast enough to test, say, every possible branch?
Oh, I'm quite certain it does explore every possible, well, wait, you're thinking of every possible sequence of all the different dialogues. That combinatorial thing is obviously gigantic. I don't think it's important to achieve that, because what you do is you look at the standard deviation, and if it's small enough, you can say, this is going to be pretty reliable. And I've got the standard deviations down. They're really small with just 100 tests. Now, there remains the possibility that a player could somehow find the exact sequence of events that blows up the system. And, the player as King Arthur finds himself, in battle against Godzilla or whatever. But I really don't, I'm very dubious of that. And in fact, the main point of this is that when the player does things right, the player gets a result very different from the random result. That is, the random results should all lead to failure. And I need a big gap between what the random results give and what, appropriate or winning play gives. So, and I've got a pretty good gap there.
It's interesting that what Choice of Games does in Choice Script is they have both types of automated testing. There's quick tests, which just runs through every single line of code and tests to make sure that it never ends up in an invalid state. and then random test, which just plays through like a player does, making a series of choices and just makes a random choice each time. And you can run the ladder as many times as you want, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 times,
Hmm.
and generate statistics that way.
That sounds good. So the first one is really more like a super duper syntax checker.
Basically, yeah, because you are writing a real programming language and not something with an inverse parser.
Yeah. It's amazing how, I mean, nowadays with JavaScript and all sorts of languages, you can get tools that'll just go through and check to make sure everything looks good. Far cry from the way it was done 40 years ago, when you spent a good 50% of your time just dealing with the stupid mistakes. So anyway, well, we're out of time. So next month, I would really like to be able to talk about Le Morte d'Arthur and give you some stuff on that. But if any of you come up with a topic that you would like to be addressed here, just send me an email.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, well, thank you, and I will see you next month.
Bye.
Have a great one.
Bye-bye.